welcome again to the Southwest Climate Outlook. Mike.
My beard is now almost covering the microphone.
Actually, I was going to comment this because, I do admire that thing on your chin, but it doesn't seem like it's getting longer. So I feel like you're kind of set in a certain length.
No, it's actually, I could braid it now and put some beads in it, kind of like Captain Jack Sparrow. I'm not sure how much longer I can take this.
So I'm walking up prior to this podcast and I'm like, all right, I'm not going to mention Mike's beard this time. It's getting old. And like, I don't know. It's just a habit, I guess.
Every Zoom meeting I'm on, somebody mentions my pandemic beard.
Yeah. Well, I apologize to all the listeners. We'll end this quickly.
Yeah. Beardwatch.org.
We should put a snapshot of that because we want to have a record of.
Well, beardwatch.org.
Okay.
It's the links. That's
Is
right.
that a thing?
No, I hope not. If it is, don't go there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, buckle up, I think, because this is it. This is the time. I love this. We're headed into the monsoon season. We now have an excuse. We could have an excuse to do these every 1 to 2 weeks where we don't have the time to do that. But like, there's just so much to talk about moving forward. The monsoon season. I hope everybody's as excited as we are. So, Mike. For this podcast, I thought we'd sort of review the first part of June. We're at the midpoint of June. We're a couple days past the official start of the monsoon season. So let's take us to how we got here for the first part of June, and it was interesting. So we'll talk about that. Then a little bit about the fire season because that's the big news, at least around Tucson and actually Phoenix for that matter, as well as the bushfire has erupted. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about fire, as is this time of year. It's the topic du jour, and then we'll get into the monsoon, some forecasts, and we're going to roll out again our version 2 of the monsoon fantasy game. That's right. So we road tested this last year. We came up with the better version, still a work in progress, but it's a little game that we're going to play throughout the monsoon season that allows us to sort of talk about different aspects of the monsoon and the numbers of these different stations around the Southwest. So what do you think, Mike?
That's awesome, Zach. Yeah, and the improved monsoon fantasy, man, you and Ben pulled some all-nighters figuring that out. I'm still catching up, so that's my excuse. If I lose, it's because I wasn't paying attention.
We'll get to that. Okay, so let's start with the recap. And what I think is most important is right around the first of the month. So a little bit, maybe the last couple days of May and into the first week, it kind of felt like the monsoon. I mean, I had never experienced, I think, late May, early June, where there was a bunch of humidity, there was some convection. It was almost like the cicadas. It almost felt like July 1.
Yeah. And what did you call it? Do you remember?
I coined that. TooSoon. It was the TooSoon. What happened there and how regional? Was that a Tucson thing? Was that more of a sort of southern Arizona, southwest New Mexico? Like, take us through that late May, early June event, if you will.
Yeah. And so we've been talking kind of the last couple of months over our Zoom casts that we've been doing here about the weather pattern that has led to some precipitation we saw in March and April, and even a little bit in May, was this trough off of the California coast, us getting kind of caught in a ridge, and then some troughs that were starting to descend across the eastern part of the country. So if you can kind of envision that the gears of the circulation of the trough off of the west coast, us being under the ridge, the anticyclone, and then more of these low pressure systems off to the east, we were getting into these kind of slow moving blocking patterns where we were getting caught in underneath the ridge. And so that flow, if you can envision it, off of the California coast at the mid levels is counterclockwise, and we're under the clockwise flow. So what that was doing is it was threading up some subtropical moisture, not unlike you'd see with a Gulf surge event during the monsoon system. monsoon season, but actually kind of drawing it up into the southwest. So we had the increasingly long days, that late May, early June sun, but we were also dynamically importing the moisture into the region. So it felt monsoony, but it wasn't monsoony in the sense of, the monsoon is really going to be that seasonal wind direction with the building of the subtropical ridge.
Right. It felt like the monsoon in the sense that we had higher, I think the dew point temperatures were around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty darn high for that early of a time. We had some convection. I think to the southeast of us here in Tucson, there were storms that didn't make it into Tucson proper. I think there was like a trace or, a little bit of rain at the Tucson airport on June 1. In fact, when you look at the stations around the southeastern part of Arizona, you don't actually see much rain, but it sort of belies the fact that there was some available. It just wasn't organized enough and widespread. So they were these very isolated systems.
The level of moisture wasn't probably sufficient enough for widespread convection. We had some precipitable water that was, I think, near record a couple of days. It was the week after Memorial Day weekend. So it was kind of the 31st, June 1st sort of transition. And then it was unsettled, strangely enough. It's of course, I was asked by an interviewer in mid-May at that point saying, okay, what are the chances of us seeing any precipitation in Arizona until the monsoon season? And as the dutiful climatologist, I said, if you look at the climatological record of daily precipitation, the May 31st and June 1st are some of the driest days in the records going back. So I was like, well, that, climatology would suggest then that there's very little chance we see anything until the monsoon. And then lo and behold, I say it out loud and I conjured up some kind of crazy, very unusual weather situation where we were getting that moisture pulled in here. But again, like you said, the convection was fairly spotty. It was largely light precipitation. I do think that there were some people, if they were lucky, were underneath some of those cells, maybe got a 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. But it did lead to some lightning starts, which lightning starts at the end of May, early June are not particularly common for Arizona.
What do you mean by lightning starts?
I'm sorry, lightning wildfire starts. Lightning starting fire, yes.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I guess when we were in it, I had a couple questions. Well, one for you is, do you remember something in the past, since you've been here paying close attention to the monsoon? Do you remember anything like that first part of June?
There's two situations, and I think they're really different. There was a couple of years ago that we ended up having precipitation in late May. Well, this is actually 2 years ago. We had some precipitation in late May that was due to a cold weather system dropping down south. And that was remember the beautiful May, probably the best May we've ever had.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we had that. And then there was another Memorial Day weekend that was very similar in 2009.
Similar to that, like a cold.
Yep, absolutely. So kind of like late winter,
right,
dropping down the southwest. And then on the other flip side, if you remember a couple years ago, and I can't remember if this was 2015 or 2016, when we had some of the very early East Pacific hurricanes.
Right, I think.
Yep. Yeah.
But that was June 15th. And that,
there were some, if you remember, there was an event where it rained in Phoenix in the first week of June.
Yeah.
And it was like a trace or 100th, and it broke the record. It broke the daily record.
Right.
And I think we ended up getting like a 10th, but it was when we were coming out of either the Godzilla El Nino, and we had that really, really warm East Pacific, and the East Pacific was cranking out hurricanes in May and early June, and we had a recurver come up, and that was the closest. And this wasn't like either.
Those are completely different scenarios than what we had. Tropical storm, a winter type circulation, and this is, I mean, you can't say it's a monsoon circulation at all. It's a kind of a novel pattern, I guess, but.
Yeah, I mean,
it doesn't seem like it should be that novel, though, I guess, is the other question that I was pondering. It's like, well, to get precip in June, all you really need is for there to be a moisture source, right? All you need for there to be is like a low pressure system that comes by that can help funnel up moisture from the subtropics or from the tropics. You've got a bunch of heating going on, and you've got some of the other ingredients for convection. It just seems like we should have more of those.
It's a great question. I think it's novel to us in the short time scale, like because we haven't seen it, this kind of particularly the situation in probably the last decade or so. But yeah, I think this is worth kind of digging into the longer term record. And I did, and I got distracted and I didn't dig it out any further, but I think we should try to track it down. So this idea of an active weather pattern and, the movement of low pressure systems kind of in the mid latitudes in May and June is absolutely common. I think it had to do with the depth of the latitude of the low was a little bit further south than I think you normally see
Right.
it. And it was slow moving because it got blocked. And so I think that it was able to sort of draw up that subtropical moisture in a more effective manner than something that was really transient and moved quickly. But yeah, it is interesting because this time of year, the subtropics are producing more moisture. As the sun angle gets higher, it's getting juicier there, and that whole moisture boundary is moving north with that sun angle.
Would
You
you
can get that alignment, you can do it.
would you think then in a June or a May that is much cooler than average, let's say, that there would, and which wasn't the case this time, but I'm just trying to think of like, well, how would we pull the atmospheric circulation a bit further south so that we would have those active weather patterns that are quite common actually tap into the moisture in a little bit further south? I mean, so could just a cooler type spring season do that? Would we expect to see perhaps these kinds of scenarios in cooler seasons?
Yeah, you don't typically. So kind of in the April, May, June transition period, you're starting to see that kind of tug of war with the mid-latitude weather systems are still quite active, and it's running into, as you move through that system, the whole northern hemisphere is starting to warm up, and you're starting to see a retraction of that jet stream. And so then climatologically, you'd start to see that transition move north. But I'm sorry, I've got a lot of notifications going off on my computer.
I hear Slack in the background. I was like,
and Hangouts. This is just the day and age. And if I mute them, I can't hear you. So it's like it's a trade-off. Then I have to do the lip reading.
that's okay. That was me slacking you anyway.
We should just Slack each other. So if it was a cooler spring, you could have a much deeper mid-latitude storm track late in the spring. I think often what ends up happening is, though, through the whole northern hemisphere, that pushes the whole subtropical moisture boundary further south, right? So it's like you can't quite, once you trade one for the other, you lose access to the moisture. And like cold, windy springs, like 2011 was just a crazy deep, cold, low pressure system that really plagued the Southwest, and it was probably related to the La Nina event of that year. And that was what drove the fire weather that made the Wallow fire just tear up, most of the White Mountains, because it had that really strong, cold, deep air mass driving a really strong gradient of temperature, which then produced the winds that pushed that fire like crazy.
Yeah, and it's also where the position of that low pressure system too, and like you said, it was sort of off the coast of California, and then there was a ridge and another trough. But if you moved the low pressure off California slightly to the west or to the east, it would have been much different here as well. So there's like subtlety in the position as well that creates perhaps like just an unlikely chain of events.
And there's real sharp gradients that can occur kind of in the spring too, with temperature and moisture. This spring, kind of in May when we were talking about it, is the low in the ridge and the low off to the east weren't particularly deep or strong. They're kind of weak and sloppy and kind of broke into pieces. And at some point, I even think that the low, or I can't even remember the whole circulation pattern, but it may have been a cutoff low that kind of wandered around too, which is not uncommon this time of year. But at that latitude, I think it it was able to sort of work with that moisture boundary that's to the south of us right now, which is really what we're looking for now, is to have a kind of a more natural progression north related to the subtropical ridge extending north, and then being able to interact with it and kind of move the moisture around the southwest.
Okay, and so that lasted pretty much close to like 8 or 9 days. So there was moisture around, there was like, we had some clouds, there was cloud sightings, which was...
Cloud sightings. I know, isn't it amazing? We actually had some decent clouds, right?
It's like, what is that?
And it was June. I didn't know what month it was.
Yeah. How spatial was that pattern? Was this just a southeast Arizona kind of thing, or was it also common further north in Flagstaff and west in Phoenix?
It was really just looking at, again, the precip wasn't particularly heavy. You know, New Mexico really should be turning on right now and seeing a lot of that June activity. And it has not been all that busy in New Mexico, more so. And it's interesting. The events that we have had have been really eastern Arizona and southeastern Arizona. And there's been some scattered convection. Western Arizona has completely been out of play. Maybe saw some unusual humidity, but not really any precip. The convection was, a lot of it was confined to mountain tops, was sort of driven by that.
Anything else in terms of rainfall or moisture to talk about up until today?
You know, we normally wouldn't talk about it at all. For the May 15th to June 15th, there typically isn't meant to talk about. So I think that us having said anything about anything happening I think we did a good job on that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully that's a harbinger of what's to come, and we'll get to that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So it is our heat season. We talked a little bit about on the last pod, sort of running some numbers for Phoenix and Tucson in terms of the number of days above 100. And Tucson, Phoenix, the last time we did the podcast was sort of tied for the most days above 100 degrees at the Phoenix airport. And it is, right now, it is running number 2. So it fell behind 1989. In fact, 1989 at this time of year had experienced 38 days of 100 plus weather, and 2020 this year is 33, tied with 2001. So it's been pretty darn hot in Phoenix, and in Tucson through mid-June we've had 13 days of 100 degree Fahrenheit temperatures or greater, and the average for the month of June is on the order of 18. So that's over the long-term historical record. And we're definitely going to beat that this year. Looking at the forecast for the next 8 days, they're all forecasted to be a few degrees above 100. So we're going to come in somewhere in the vicinity of the mid 20s, I would say, for the number of days in June above 100 degrees. So
you remember what our bets were?
I forgot.
I remember what my number was.
You don't remember my number?
No, I don't remember your number.
What was? I totally forgot. Darn. What was your number?
25.
25. There's definitely a shot at that. Boy, I don't even remember. All these days are like interminable. Like my memory is shot now. Was I higher or lower? Do you recall?
Let's wait for the final number and then I'll tell you.
Okay, we'll do that in July then. We'll make sure to prepare for that.
So just a quick aside, Zach, I don't know if you can look out your window real quick, but the Bighorn fire is just absolutely blown up.
No. So that's it. So that's a good transition, Mike, because we wanted to talk about fire. So that's the big story here in Southeast Arizona, is the Bighorn fire that started during that event that we just spoke about. I think it was on the June 5th, dry lightning.
Yep.
Striking Push Ridge, igniting a fire. And it's been blazing ever since, and providing some really kind of frightening images on Twitter and whatnot of they had to evacuate parts of the foothills in Tucson. And so what are you seeing? I don't have a window view, Mike.
I'm in our back bedroom and I can't quite see out the window, but I can see the Catalinas out the window. I'm going to just peek out there right now. The cloud right now looks like a pyrocumulus. It's a full, and this is a very dry day, so there's no moisture in the atmosphere. So this is all completely smoke at this point. It is just absolutely kind of a terrifying image looking at that right now. It's very much, if anybody was here in the Aspen fire of 2003, it's right along the ridge top and unfortunately pretty close to Summerhaven at this point. So I don't know what the fate of that is right now.
It's a big fire. They've got 700 personnel working it, 8 hotshot crews. There's been a number of slurry drops and a whole bunch of helicopters. They've been fighting it for quite some time. They had a back burn in the low desert, which was kind of interesting. Mike, I don't know if you have anything to say about that. It was something that I've never heard of, but I don't pay too much attention to wildland fire management.
It's been a really interesting fire to watch from TooSoon. We haven't had one of this size on Mount Lemmon that I can remember since 2003 living here. And the fact that the fire started in the low elevations in really typically kind of fuel limited areas, the kind of lower desert where it typically wouldn't carry fire. So I think that we've had a couple of discussions offline about it's really possible the last couple of wet years, really the wet falls, which drive a lot of that lower elevation desert vegetation, may be the culprit for this fire being able to carry itself, as far as it had through the lower elevations and interacting with some invasive species in some areas and burning around saguaros, which are not fire adapted. It's very, very problematic for saguaros. But today it's made it up to, it's burning at 8,000, 9,000 feet right now. And it's burning in an area that burned severely in 2003. So those are, and it's in a year that's not a drought year. Like we would really consider this. We've had good winter precipitation 2 years in a row. So that, the typical way we look at kind of fuel metrics would suggest that wouldn't lead to the fire carrying as much. But I think the short-term fire weather conditions, and today it's very windy, there's a red flag warning, and the aspect of the fire, the fire is just working it's moving uphill and with the wind. So I think that those things together are really carrying this forward now.
Yeah, so a red flag warning. I had to look this up because I forget the criteria every year, but it's basically when there's really low humidity, less than 15%, when winds are sustained for three or more hours at over 20 miles per hour.
Yeah, we had a couple days ago, mid-level, low pressure, high pressure kind of funneling in the moisture to Southeast Arizona, which led to some heavy rain across Southeast Arizona. And thankfully, no lightning strikes out here on the Catalinas to start any new fires, but it's given away to a much drier air mass has moved through on the westerlies. And now we've got a really strong westerly wind pushing the fire uphill right now and across the ridge line.
Historically, the monsoon starts around July 4th. So there's, another 2 weeks worth of likely very, very dry conditions, probably longer too, because it takes some time for the ground to moisten up in earnest after the monsoon begins. So we've got quite a bit more time for there to be fires. It is the season, and there's other ones burning in Arizona and New Mexico as well. I think in Arizona, I can count 10, 11 fires at a greater, what are these? Greater than 1,000 acres. The other one of note that's made the news recently is the bushfire right out close to Phoenix, right on the sort of edges of Roosevelt Lake. It sort of blew up in the last couple of days.
That's a big fire. Currently the largest in the country, I believe.
That's right. And that is burning in, I don't know if you said this, Mike, but that's burning in the lower desert as well.
This really comes out of the fire briefings from the National Interagency Fire Center, was that there was this concern with the lower to mid elevations in the deserts, the fuel loading. We run into this climatological period, which is typically very dry, low relative humidities, and hot. And so that really drives these fires. But this June was so weird because, we end up kind of bobbing around with some unusually humid days, which I think could help slow things down, but it also then led to that fire start. The point being is that, the human start fires in that driest part of the year can lead to these really large fires. But we've had this weird mix of the lockdown with COVID leading to, either less recreation or maybe more recreation, more illicit recreation in some areas. I think that's kind of an interesting background dynamic. And then this, a lightning strike in early June is not terribly common. And then that's what started this fire. And again, it's that weird convergence of having a couple of good wet winters leading to some of that enhanced fuel loadings is leaving the deserts kind of primed for this.
It just goes to show you that just how fragile, I think, or how fire prone this region is, because if it's wet, that's good for 1 year in terms of potentially suppressing fire in that year, but it also sets the stage for fire in future years. And if you're dry, you don't get the fuel load build up for future years, but you're like more prone in that year. So, and for the most part, you get these oscillations, wet and dry. There's quite a bit of variability. So, this is maybe stating a very obvious point, but we're basically in a very fire prone region.
That's the classic, Tom Swetnam, Julio Betancourt paper from 20 years ago on the cycling.
Behind, is that what you're telling me?
Well, no, I think that you intuited a paper in Science. So good for you. The wet, dry conditions can lead to fuel loading and then fuel drying, and that can over time fill in the landscape with fires. And if you can have this fuel loading and then a really long dry stretch without any fire starts, some of that vegetation, like annuals, will just kind of break down and crumble and go away. But I think if the timing isn't quite right, where you're starting to grow stuff that's got some access to water and is going to actually kind of grow, then you're going to end up having fuel loadings. And then, and finally too, that fire in, some of the sky islands and certainly some of the forests, most of the forests around here are fire adapted, and they need periodic fire to clear out understories. And so, this fire burning across the Catalinas ideally it's a slow moving, low intensity fire that does not burn up a lot of the trees, and especially the ponderosa pine. But unfortunately, you get a really bad fire weather day like today, and I think it can be too much and push the fire too hot and too fast.
So there's one other really large fire in Arizona, and that's the Mangum fire, which is close to the Arizona-Utah border, maybe 50 miles or so west of Page. And then in New Mexico, there's currently 4 fires larger than 1,000 acres. Yeah, Arizona it has had much more acreage burn than New Mexico, but there's still quite a bit of time left in our fire season. Pretty eventful from the standpoint of people living at the base of Mount Lemmon and in Tucson. It's a ever-present site, bad air quality. But yeah, anything else you want to add there, Mike?
No, sorry. I keep looking out the window. No, I think that, I just hope everything's okay up there on the top of the mountain.
Did they evacuate Summer Haven yet?
They did. I think Summer Haven it's all firefighters now. And
now part of that burned down, 10 years ago, was it?
2003 with the Aspen fire. Yeah, it's been a while.
There's a lot of people up there, so let's hope they can make a lot of firefighters. Let's hope they can make some progress and beat it back.
Be safe. Yep.
All right. So monsoon forecast, Mike. What do we know from the people who do this for a living?
It's a good question. Well, there is. So we're recording the day before the official CPC forecasts come out for the rest of the monsoon season. So
I thought you might have had privy info, but they don't. They keep
my early access pass. No, my early access pass expired.
Okay,
I don't have that anymore.
So
yeah,
I bet we can guess what it's going to be, though.
I bet we can guess too. Yeah, what's your guess?
My guess is there's no forecast. It's an equal chances forecast.
My guess is equal chances as well, and that would be for the 1 month and the July, August, September 3 month.
Right, and that's what it was a month ago.
Yeah, and again, it's not a slight in any way. I think there's just very little to grab onto right now to understand what we might be looking at for the rest of the season.
What about some of the dynamic models? Have you looked under their hoods? I'm looking at the North American Multi-Model Ensemble right now. I don't know if you've seen that.
I haven't looked at the NMME as of late. I've looked at the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 day forecast. So the 8 to 14 day puts us at July 1st, right? So we're getting into kind of climatological typical start of activity as far as dew points when we really start to look at that window. I mean, I think that the 15th to 30th, I think makes sense as sort of wide guardrails around the season. But then if we're looking at the onset of activity into southern Arizona, now New Mexico should be seeing more activity now and through the next couple of weeks. But the outlook for New Mexico right now is actually a lean towards below average precipitation in both the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 in that kind of early season monsoon region. And then it does have a slight below average probability anomaly for Southeast Arizona. But I want to note though, it is the lowest shift in that tercile. So it's a signal to, and if you read the discussion, there's some signs on the dynamical models that it's not ideal, but it's very low confidence at this point. So I think we're really still in this wait and see. There's not a real strong lean in any of the forecasts that we're gonna run behind very quickly, I guess.
What about some of the indicators? Like, the monsoon also starts earlier in Mexico around the Sierra Madre Occidental. And looking at the precipitation there, 15 day totals, it seems like it's basically been near average for the most part. There's been some rain and it's been close to average there. So I don't know if that tells us one way or the other. It has started raining in the Sierra Madres, but it's not copious by any means.
I pulled together some long-term climatological maps of ridge position and precipitable water and precipitation. And what I was struck by was the June 15th to June 30th window, how quickly there is climatologically a change from southern Mexico up into the southwest. It happens very quickly. And so we're now in this forecast window of where you'd expect to see, like, what is happening right now isn't necessarily, like, if it's terribly bad down there and it's quiet, doesn't necessarily mean 2 weeks from now that won't have completely switched around and shifted north, which is why, I think we're kind of in this messy.
But it's a leading indicator, right?
Like leading indicator, but it's like a leading indicator before it has happened almost, you know what I mean? It's like it can happen really quickly. Like we could have the same conversation 5 days from now and see that it has raced north, right? The models have been kind of all over the place. The GEF, so the Global Forecasting System, the ensemble, and it's suggesting, like, on the 5 day totals that it is raining. It's raining in Mexico, but it's raining less than it normally would be for this time of year, which I thought was kind of interesting. And then if you kind of move that forward, it evens out a little bit, but it seems to be a little bit slower than climatology. So, but again, that is not a deal breaker by any point.
Right.
And I think there's so little to grab onto. The Gulf of California sea surface temperatures they're slightly above average, so they seem to be on track.
So I was looking at that this morning and I was actually trying to find a comparison to last year, and I found it in a tweet by a meteorologist in Phoenix, but I couldn't actually find. The tweet made a reference to the fact that the Gulf of California sea surface temperatures were close to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than they were last year, but I couldn't verify that because I couldn't find the data for last year at this time. But for the most part, they are sort of, much of the water it's above average. In fact, for most of that Gulf, it is on the order of close to 2 degrees C warmer than average. And most of it is above the 26 degrees Celsius sea surface temperature threshold. Not a threshold, but it's one of the markers that people look at to see if there's favorable moisture availability that can then waft into our region.
Yeah, you got kind of these kind of breakpoint thresholds, like 27 and a half, and then I think 29 at the upper end. They're all going to relate to the warmth of that water and its ability to how much moisture it's basically going to give off to the overlying atmosphere and create the instability. And we're looking for that as being a really important moisture source on the Arizona side here for those Gulf surges. So they're not going to really occur until we start to hit some of those threshold temperatures. But like we saw last week and earlier in the month, if you get the low and the high in the right spot, it'll still kind of funnel up moisture this way. So you can end up in the end of June still having this kind of pre-monsoon transient weather, these lows moving through that will still push moisture up into the region. One of the forecast discussions I read, I think from the TooSoon office a couple days ago, though, was suggesting that the subtropical ridge does push north, and we get into some southerly and easterly flow even as early as next week. But again, it's kind of early for it to really settle in and for us to be in it for any extended period of time until we get into July.
I think those sea surface temperatures are sort of maybe give a slight indication of a good scenario, a favorable scenario for the monsoon. That's my take on it, particularly in light of the fact that it has been a much above average temperature situation over the last 3 months. And, I would expect that those sea surface temperatures are going to continue to increase as they do at this time, and they'll continue to be above average. And when the conditions are right, it'll move more moisture into the region. That's my take. Do you have a rebuttal against that?
No, I agree. I think that the Gulf, the sea surface temperatures in the Gulf are a lagging indicator of what the weather's been doing anyways. And so I think last year we ended up having that weak trough off of the California coast that messed with the monsoon the whole year. And I think that was an impact on the sea surface temps in the Gulf of California. And I can't remember what the evolution of them would look like
right
throughout the season. But the fact that we've ended up under this ridge is, I think, aiding and abetting the Gulf of California sea surface temps. It certainly isn't hurting them. You don't want to have downwind flow down the Gulf of California, because that will lead to the opposite effect that we're looking for. We want the flow to be up the Gulf of California, which will help it sustain those high temperatures and give off that moisture that we can use.
I've got the North American multi-model ensemble, which has 7 different models in it from US and Canada. There's a couple different patterns that maybe is more consistent across these 7 than not consistent. And that is, again, for Arizona and New Mexico, there's no real rainfall. It's not, the models aren't leaning one way or the other, and that sort of goes to the Climate Prediction Center's equal chances forecast that we spoke to a minute ago. But the other thing is, all but 2, it looks like, of the models kind of call for above rainfall in the Sierra Madre Occidental. So that, to me, I don't know. I don't know how much you want to sort of extract out of this, but that at least is an inconsistent signal from what I just spoke about, and may suggest that, if you got a lot of rain down there and you get some other atmospheric dynamics in place that you really can't predict at this kind of a window, then there's the moisture there. Conversely, there's kind of always the moisture there, right?
Last year was not good for Mexico as well. It was kind of a poor monsoon all the way. So I completely agree with you. If northern Mexico is having a good monsoon, it's harder for us to have, I think it's harder for us to have a bad monsoon. You've got to have other things kind of competing with each other at that point. The NMME, the multi-model ensemble mean, is a wash. The international multi-model ensemble, though, it's got a really weird really dry signal off of Mexico.
That's over the Sierra Madres. It's a very dry signal. But the North American multi-model ensemble, we're getting into the weeds here.
We are, but it's these competing forecast signals. They're not converging, which I think is a good sign, in the sense that it's the glass half full idea that none of them are saying it's going to be terribly bad. So maybe there's some information in that.
Yeah. Okay. So now we got to think a little bit about what we think the monsoon is going to look like. So let me try to introduce this game. We're calling it Horseshoes, Hand Grenades, and the Monsoon. So what this is for the next 3 months, we've picked 5 sites across Arizona, New Mexico that are in the major cities. So Tucson, Phoenix, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, and El Paso. What we're going to do is we're going to guess for each month what decile the precipitation will fall in. Okay, so basically a decile. Let's say there's 100 data points for Tucson, so 100 years of data. The decile splits those 100 years, sorts them from low to high, splits those 100 years into 10 equal bins of 10 data points. So your 0 to 10% decile is your lowest 10 values on the record, and your 10 to 20% is your next 10, and so on and so forth. So each of those deciles or those bins have a particular precipitation range that are defined by the lowest and highest value in that bin. Okay, so our task, Mike, is for each of those cities, for each month, and we'll do this. The next pod we'll do for August. We're going to predict right now for July. But for each month and for each of those cities, we pick what we expect the decile to be. Okay, now we get points for being close. We get more points for being spot on. So if we hit a bullseye, we get 10 points. And if we're just one category off, high or low, we get 5 points. And if we're 2 categories off, we get 1 point. A perfect prediction per month would be 50 points. So we get 10 points for each of the 5 cities. And then a perfect prediction over the course of the monsoon season would be 150 points. Okay. Now you can get 0 points is the low value. I don't expect that'll happen, Mike, particularly from you. I expect you'll get half the points. That's my.
Thanks, Zach.
We're going to make our guesstimates for this first month. Okay. Why don't you walk us through what you chose?
Okay. So Phoenix, Tucson, Flagstaff, Albuquerque, and El Paso. I chose the 30 to 40 decile for Phoenix, 40 to 50 for Tucson, 30 to 40 for Flagstaff, Albuquerque, and El Paso. So I'm leaning a little bit dry just off of climatology, mostly because I was traumatized by last year.
That's your rationale. Anything in the observations that are causing you to go? I mean, that is a consistent scenario here.
I'm a little traumatized from last year of really expecting the monsoon to settle in, and it was just quite miserable. And it was amazing how miserable it was as you went up to like Flagstaff in northern parts of Arizona. So,
but I got a different take on last year.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you're right. It was. I mean, I think Flagstaff was like record dry, and it was sort of dismal.
Yeah.
But there was also a ton of moisture around, and it felt like a few random things needed to happen, and we would have had a pretty good monsoon season. Like we had the moisture there. We just couldn't like sponge it out of the atmosphere.
Last year, this actually came out of Paul from the Weather Service in Phoenix when he did the postmortem on the monsoon. He pointed out that the moisture as you went to northwest Arizona was much below average. So there was a sharp gradient in moisture from southeast Arizona to northern Arizona, and it really had to do with the ridge position and that pesky trough off of California. And so instead of the ridge position being sort of built north and all of us being under this dome of moisture, the moisture was shunted and broke right across kind of Tucson and to the southeast. And so it really wasn't, it was unusually dry, even atmospheric humidity as you went further north. So I'm a little worried this weather pattern with this weird trophy thing that's been off of the West Coast. It looks a little bit like last year. I don't think it's anything like last year of what, as far as the forcings. It could go away really, really quickly, but I'm kind of, for July, I'm holding not that far off of climatology, but I'm also a tiny bit pessimistic, and I'm pessimistic for the further north you go too.
And I'm looking at the July values for last year, and they are really dismal for those 5 cities. So Tucson, 45% of its average, long-term average. Phoenix, 7%. Flag, 30%. Albuquerque, 81%. The only one that's decent. And El Paso, 8%. So boy, pretty dismal. You're right. But I just think if a few things would have been different, then maybe Tucson and Southeast Arizona would have actually come out with an okay monsoon, if not an average one.
It's also the luck of the draw with where the rain gauges are too, because there were pockets that did fine.
Right.
Yep.
Okay. Anything else you want to say before I launch into mine?
Nope. I want to hear from you, and then I think Ben's got to explain.
Yeah, Ben's got some too. Okay, so you and I are kind of polar opposites, which we didn't plan this, but I'm happy that we have something different logics here. So for Phoenix, I went 40 to 50% decile. For Tucson, I'm bullish, 60 to 70%. Flag, 60 to 70%. So we're really different there. And then Albuquerque and El Paso are slightly below average at 40 to 50%. So my logic is based both on some of the existing signals, but also a sort of random assortment of probably meaningless statistics. I don't know. Maybe I'm taking this early June thing as a good omen. That's based on nothing. I think it's a good omen, though, that we had some unusualness to talk about and to experience. But I do think that the sea surface temperatures off the coast, Gulf of California, can come into play here, and also what we talked about in the models. There's some indication that the Sierra Madres may be slightly wetter in the start of the monsoon. So I think those bode well for perhaps a better scenario than last year. So I'm not that it's not a depressing scenario like it was last year. So some of my random assortment of statistics is, so I kind of was toying with the idea. My first inclination was like, well, why wouldn't I just go all the same signal for all of the stations, right?
Yeah, why wouldn't you?
Right. Well, so I looked at that. And so I just said, okay, well, how many times, what was the average number of positive values across those stations each year, and above average and below average? So it turns out that on average, 1.5 of the stations, so it's kind of a funky number, but 1.5 of the stations were above average, 3.5 were below average. So they weren't all the same, is the point. Okay. So so that fuels, I've got 2 above average and 3 below average.
That's very interesting. Okay.
So that's how I picked those numbers. And then I was like, well, are there stations that are correlated with each other? And it turns out that they're not really correlated with each other. And I was trying to use this. I was like, well, if I go above average for Tucson, should I also do it for Phoenix? And the highest correlation is actually 0.5, and that's between El Paso and Albuquerque. And that's why I chose the same signal for Albuquerque and El Paso. And then the rest of the correlations are, at most, Phoenix and Flag are correlated by 0.4. And everything else is, Tucson and Flag is 0.3. Albuquerque and Tucson, as one can imagine, is pretty far away, is 0.1. So there's not a ton of correlation. So there is quite a bit of variability at the monthly level across these stations. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to pick one signal, dry or wet, and stick with that.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I'm sorry, I have to root for you getting both of them wrong at the same time, which I think would be really, really hilarious, is if they do indeed go exactly the opposite directions and cancel each other out. So
there are years in which all of them had the same sign.
For sure, yeah.
It's just and this is an artifact of averaging, right? Like it's just on average, that wasn't the case. And more often than not, they're around 2 and 3 have the same sign than 1 and 4.
Holy moly, you really thought this through. I hope
Well,
it pays
I'm
off.
spending a little bit of time because, which I didn't say beforehand, there is beer on the line here.
There is.
And I don't know if Ben wants to chime in on his logic.
Sure.
He should, because
I leaned hard into this horseshoes idea, and I made my guesses about the way I play horseshoes, which is just to close my eyes and let it rip. So I'm going to work my way up. El Paso and Albuquerque, I just decided, okay, I think they're going to have a wet July. So I went 60 to 70% for Albuquerque and 70, 80% for El Paso. Conveniently, that runs opposite to what you guys said. So if I'm right, that means I know you're wrong. So we're good there. Flagstaff, I was a little pessimistic about for really no good reason other than I just figured dry. TooSoon, I went really low on at the 20 to 30% decile. Again, very much hoping that I'm wrong, but after last year and just kind of what's going on right now, it's hard not to be a little pessimistic. And then Phoenix, I have to admit, I'm gaming the system a little bit because I do not think we're going to hit the 60 to 70% decile. It does not take much rain to get there. So all it would take is for one storm to push through, and I'd get my little 10 points there. And since you guys are down in the low end of the distribution, I figured that's my chance to get out ahead because definitely did not put a lot of thought into this. So.
No, that's good. And there's so much variability across the three of us. It is kind of amazing. I was actually expecting much more similarity than dissimilarity, and that's not what I got here.
I kind of do mean to wish this on you, Ben, but I hope it rains really, really hard right next to the station, but not on the station.
Yeah.
You mean for the Phoenix?
Yeah. Yes, for your.
And that's certainly possible. So.
All right. So Ben, you have anything else you want to say about that, or should I?
No, we'll throw together a little visualization that shows what these plots or what these guesses look like, just so folks can see, because the text doesn't, it's like percentages and things, and so we'll put together a little thing that visualizes this for folks for the podcast. So
that's right. When we send this out, we'll tally up. We'll provide an explanation of the game and show our estimates.
And if all goes well, we'll have a form that folks can fill out and guess themselves. And I'll just leave that as a standalone in case that ends up not being true. I can just cut that out. So.
Right. And this is not gambling. There's no monetary gain, and we're not making any money. And quietly, we're not trading beer either. That's what the lawyers told me to say. Do we have any lawyers?
We probably do.
Okay. All right. Okay. Excellent, man. I am really, really excited about this monsoon season. We need a little excitement in our lives these days. Well, maybe we don't. We have the Bighorn Fire to look at, but the monsoon is a nice excitement. So yeah, anything else? Any final parting shots?
I hope my pessimism is not warranted. And it's not even that pessimistic. So
it's not, but I don't know. Maybe my memory is failing me, but I always thought you were optimistic, or am I misremembering about the monsoon?
I was until the Godzilla El Nino, and then last summer it kind of took all of my climate exceptionalism out of me now. I just don't have it anymore.
No, I look fondly. I mean, I my memory has like encoded, I think it was July 2018, or was it 2017, the really epic July, and that has imprinted over all of my monsoon memories. And so that's all I see.
I know every year you talk about it.
Was it 2018 or 2017?
They actually both were quite good for TooSoon.
But yeah. You know which one? There was one that was like, there was like a 2-week, like 17-day span that was just like epic.
Yeah, I think it was 2017. That was when in TooSoon, the storms would just roll over the Catalinas and consume it. Yeah.
All right, so should we prelude at all next podcast, Mike?
Yeah, so we're going to take a deep dive into the moisture sources, I think, next time. Talk a little bit more about some monsoon mechanics, read some papers, try to make sense of them, and try to talk about them in a sensical way. Hopefully we can kind of explain them. But I think at that point, hopefully we're in monsoon moisture, so it'll be quite timely to talk about it. So this idea, we're going to continue to talk about the mechanics of the monsoon as we understand them kind of going forward here.
Excellent. As always, gentlemen, it was a pleasure.
Yes, take care all, and happy monsoon.
Yep, happy monsoon. All right. We golden?
Yeah, let me mute and drop offs because the sound is better.